When the blizzard took Tundra, my old Alaskan Malamute, I felt like the last door to my wife's memory had slammed shut. The house was silent, like a tomb I had dug in my own heart. Outside, it was still day near Whitefish, Montana, but the light was flat and gray. It was the kind of light where you couldn't tell the difference between the snow in the sky and the snow on the ground. I opened the back door as I always did. Same time, same habit. And Tundra slipped past my boot. She was 13. Her muzzle was pure white, and her hip would stiffen slightly when she turned, but that proudly curled tail swayed with the same quiet dignity she'd shown my wife the day we first brought her home. She wasn't just an old Malamute. She was everything I had left. Go on, I told her. She stepped out onto the porch, lifted her nose high, and read the air like a dog reads a newspaper. The snow had begun to blow sideways, scratching at the ponderosa pines that ringed my property like old, weary sentinels. Normally, she'd walk quietly to the back of the shed, do her business, and be back on the mat before my coffee got cold. I heard her pause on the steps, and then, silence. Only the sound of the wind remained. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed, and I told myself she was sniffing something. That the old warrior's instincts were still there. At 20 minutes, I put down my cup. At 40, I listened for a bark that never came. I grabbed my late wife Eleanor's heavy winter coat from the hook. The coat still faintly smelled of her perfume and would smoke. It hadn't changed after all these winters. I slipped it on, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the white country. The snow hit my face like cold, tiny needles. The yard I'd mowed for 30 years was erased beneath snowdrifts. I called her name again and again. Tundra. My voice was swallowed by the wind and came back shattered. I found a few shallow paw prints near the porch, starting to drift over. And then nothing. No trail to follow, no direction to go. Just an old man slowly turning in a circle, shouting a name the storm didn't care about. After a while, my legs began to shake. More from age than the cold. Still, I walked the fence line, checked the culvert, and squinted at clumps of brush until my eyes watered with tears. Yellow shapes I thought were her disappeared as I approached. By the time the light began to fail, my fingers were numb. I called her name one last time, softly. Not at the storm, but at her, wherever she was. And then I stumbled back to the suddenly unfamiliar house. I closed the door slower than I'd opened it, expecting her to slide in at the last second. She didn't come. That night, for the first time since my wife's funeral, I spread a blanket on the floor, preparing to mourn the rest of the family I had left. Pain has a sound of its own. It's the silence after you stop calling their names. I woke up cold and stiff on that blanket the next morning. My hand was resting where her head should have been. For a few seconds, I forgot she was gone and whistled toward the back door, just as always. Habit is a cruel thing. Only the hum of the refrigerator answered. I walked the yard again. Slower this time. Calling less. There was no strength left in my voice. I called the neighbor and asked if he'd seen an old Malamute wandering near the road. He hadn't. Keep an eye out, I thanked him, but in my heart, I was picking the spot beneath the largest spruce where I would bury her if I found her. Between the calls and the blizzard, I slipped into the past. I saw my wife standing in this same kitchen. Younger. Holding a wiggling yellow furball. I remembered saying I didn't want a dog. The puppy slid out of her arms, waddled across the tile, and sat on my boot. He chose us, Frank, she'd laughed. Not the other way around. By the second day, the snow fell harder, as if something had broken in the sky. I still filled Tundra's water bowl and put it in its usual spot. I still left her leash hanging by the door. I couldn't bring myself to put anything away. The house no longer felt lived in, it was just filled with the ghosts of fur. I spoke to empty rooms as if my wife was still there. Eleanor, if that dog doesn't come back, I'm finished. Are you there, Eleanor? I'm too old to start over with this grief, I said. The wind finally died down on the morning of the third day. The world outside looked as if someone had pulled a clean white sheet over everything. I pulled an old shovel from the corner. Not out of hope, but because I wanted to be ready to wrap her gently if I found her. No plastic bag, no rough hole. She deserved better. I walked to the back door, put my fingers on the cold metal handle, and took a breath like a man heading to a funeral he'd already attended once. And just as I started to turn the knob, I heard it. A soft but distinct scratch on the wooden door. So quiet it didn't seem real, almost lost in the last breath of the storm. When I opened the door, her eyes were the first thing I saw. And they weren't asking for help for herself. Tundra was standing on the porch, or what was left of it. Her fur was caked with ice, her muzzle was frosted white, and every breath seemed to struggle its way out of her chest. Snow was clumped along her back and tail, as if she'd been lying in it for a long time. But her eyes were clear and focused. She locked her gaze on me, and then slowly tilted her head toward the yard. At first, I didn't understand. I was too busy counting her ribs beneath the wet fur, checking her paws for blood, and whispering her name like a prayer answered incorrectly. Then, behind her, I saw the tiny shapes moving in the deep snow. 5 small shadows, no bigger than my forearm, following her unsteady tracks. Puppies. Different colors, different markings, maybe a month old, all trembling as if their feet didn't belong to them. The world went incredibly quiet. No wind, no storm, just the sound of small, frantic breathing. They tried to cluster around her hind legs, seeking warmth, but she didn't have any left to give. I reached for her collar, ready to drag her off the porch and onto whatever ground wasn't snow under my feet. She pulled away from my hand and, instead, nudged one of the puppies forward with her nose. It was a single, firm push, like a command, "Take this one, old man." "I'm here, girl," I told her. "My name is Frank." I thought I was too old for volunteering for new life at 70. She apparently disagreed. I bent, my knees protesting, and lifted the first puppy. It was soaked through, snow packed between its toes, and its belly was ice cold. It gave a small cry and tried to burrow into my coat. Another puppy slid sideways off the steps and disappeared into a snowdrift. So I grabbed that one, too. My heart hammered like I was in the middle of a rescue I hadn't even signed up for. I carried the 2 inside and returned for the next 2. My hands were losing feeling, and my breath came in short, white clouds. Each time I returned, Tundra was there, blocking the path. Her body was a shield between the children and the white nothingness behind them. When I finally closed the door, shutting out the storm, I counted them on the kitchen floor. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I noticed the 5th one wasn't moving. I had buried my wife. I wasn't going to bury another snow-soaked puppy on this kitchen floor. I knelt beside the unmoving creature. The fur was frozen, the tiny body limp. The other 4 were swarming Tundra, climbing over each other, clinging to what little warmth was left in her tired bones. I moved faster than a 70-year-old man had a right to. I dragged blankets and sheets into the living room in front of the fireplace, spreading them until the floor looked like a makeshift den. 2 by 2, I carried them. I dried them. I talked to them, trying to make them hear something other than the storm. Tiny claws, tiny ribs, tiny hearts drumming against my fingers. I tucked them along Tundra's belly, and the shaking, half-frozen old Malamute pulled them closer with her jaw. She licked their faces and gave a low, rumbling groan. She tried to curl around them, but there was little strength left in her body. Their mouths searched for a mother who wasn't there. Bringing them here had taken almost everything she had. "Your job is done, girl," I told her. "It's my turn to try." I rummaged through the pantry, past the jars and cans my wife used to organize. I found powdered milk, baby bottles from when my grandchildren were infants, and a few syringes without needles. Pinning the phone with my chin, I called the local vet while boiling water and mixing formula. He gave me quantities, times, and a quiet warning. Returning to the blankets, the room smelled of warm milk and wet dog fur. The 4 puppies were wiggling and crying, pressing closer to Tundra's chest. And the 5th, I lifted him gently, like something made of thin glass. No sound, no resistance, just the barest hint of warmth beneath the cold hide. I put the tiny bottle to his mouth and started counting in my head. 1, 2, 3. On the 4th second, the little diaphragm convulsed. It was so small, just a vibration under my thumb, like trying to strike a match in the wind. Then a ragged little breath, a damp, rasping sound, followed by the weakest cry I had ever heard. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until it escaped as a shaky laugh. "That's right," I whispered. "Slowly, boy. One at a time." When he took a few more sips, I settled him in with the others. It was then that I really looked at them. One who cried about everything, even when nothing was wrong. One who explored constantly, nose first, always trying to burrow past Tundra. A third who kept sliding off the blanket as if it were a personal hobby, only to wiggle back to the cold floor. I sat in the dim light of the fireplace, watching all that clumsy, demanding life. And without patience, a thought crossed my mind. "I'm too old for this," I muttered. The guilt followed instantly. Too old for what, Frank? Too old to breathe? Too old to help something smaller than my hand survive? When they had settled, I noticed something was wrong. The puppies weren't her color. They didn't even look close. The ears, the feet, the build. It hit me then. These were not her puppies. They were German shepherds. 5 of them, far too small and cold to have survived a night outside. That meant my old Malamute had walked out into that storm and brought someone else's problem home. My stomach clenched when I finally pulled my eyes away from the pups and truly looked at her. The fur between her toes was frozen solid. Her pads were cracked and scuffed. Tiny specks of dried blood darkened the pale fur. Even lying down, her tail trembled. She wasn't looking at me for help. Her eyes were still fixed on the puppies, and if one wandered too far, she would lower her head and nudge it back into the warmth. I brought a bowl of warm water and a towel and tended to her paws one by one, picking out slivers of ice and speaking softly. "You're a brave girl," I told her. "You walked farther today than I have in a year." I still didn't know where the puppies had come from, or what had happened to the mother who should have been curled around them instead of my old dog. Then, while drying the noisiest one, my finger snagged on something buried in its fur. A rough, sharp band of blue plastic. I pulled it out, and when I realized it was part of a broken collar, I knew this wasn't just nature. Someone had left them there. By the second day, my quiet little house sounded like a nursery set up inside a snow globe. The storm still raged around the walls, but inside, there was only life and noise. The crying of puppies. The sound of tiny claws scratching at the blankets, and Tundra's contented sigh whenever a small one burrowed into her flank. The fireplace crackled as if trying to keep up. Every few hours, the alarm on my old cell phone went off. Feed the noisy one first, or he'd scream loud enough to peel the paint. Check the wanderer, so he didn't tumble off the edge of the blanket again. Change the towels if they were too damp. Fresh, warm formula. Wash the bowls. Wash my hands. Repeat. I ate standing at the counter, one eye on the skillet, the other on the floor. There was no safe spot to put a chair without risking a tail or a foot being stepped on. I didn't mind. I thought at 70 I was done walking around toys. Apparently, they just changed from plastic cars to German Shepherd puppies. By the third or fourth feeding around midnight, I was moving on reflex. Waking when they cried, lying down when they settled. Like when my own children were small. And like the later years, when my wife was sick, and the long nights became small islands of worry and watchfulness. I thought then, this is the hardest time. Now, I sat on the same floor, in the same dim light, holding a bottle to a puppy small enough to fit in one hand. And I heard myself whisper, I thought my life was winding down. Instead, someone hit the rewind button. I gave them temporary names just to tell them apart. The crier was Siren. The one who was always sliding off the blanket, Tumble. The quiet one who buried his face in Tundra's chest whenever the machine started, Shadow. I felt it was too soon for real names. Names meant staying. Tundra was eating little by little. Drinking water. Her breathing still whistled, as if the air had to climb a hill to get to her lungs. And between feedings, she slept deeply, but if one puppy cried for more than a few seconds, her nose would drop low. Her head would lift, pulling them closer, checking them in turn, like a tired nurse refusing to end her shift. When the night finally went quiet for a moment, I stepped out onto the front porch. The trees hung heavy with snow, dark outlines against the fading sky. I looked out toward the woods where she must have found them. Where some human hand had abandoned them. If there's a mother out there, I said into the cold air, I hope you know your children are safe. I let the silence answer. But I also knew someone hadn't wanted them to be safe. The last heartfelt conversation I'd had in this kitchen wasn't with a vet. It was with my dying wife. She was sitting right there at the table. Thinner than she should have been, a blanket over her lap. The window cracked slightly, letting in the Montana cold she always said she liked. Tundra was lying at her feet, younger then, her head resting on Eleanor's knee, her eyes tracking between us as if she knew something was ending. My wife's hand was on that soft, yellow ruff. She's not just a dog, Frank, you know that, she'd said. She's a piece of me that stays here. I remember staring at the wood grain so I wouldn't have to look into her eyes. She reached out and laced her fingers through mine. Promise me you won't close up after I'm gone, she'd whispered. Especially not to her. Don't let her be the last thing you care about. Back in the present, the kitchen looked different, but the feeling was the same. Same table, same dog. Only now, 5 German Shepherd puppies were spread across my floor, turning my grief into something noisy and breathing. That afternoon, the phone rang. It was the neighbor. Frank, you can't keep 5 puppies, you know that, he said. I know a man who runs a ranch outside of town. He might take them. Take them off my hands like a bag of party trash. I said I'd think about it, hung up, and just stood there, listening to the tiny snores and whimpers coming from the blanket. I felt like I was standing in a place I'd been before. Close the door and save myself, or leave it cracked open and risk losing everything all over again. That night, Tundra could barely walk. Her back legs dragged a little. Each step seemed to cost her more than she possessed. Still, She crossed the room and gently lay down so that all 5 puppies could snuggle up against her. They wiggled, they sighed, they made space where there was none. She let out a long breath, a breath that sounded like both pain and relief, and rested her head on her front paws. I lay on the floor beside her, listening to my old bones complain, and whispered, "I can't lose you too, girl." Just then, I felt her heart thrumming fast beneath my hand. The house felt wrong the next morning. Too quiet. No frantic demands for breakfast from Siren. No clumsy sound of tumble rolling off the blanket. Just the slow tick of the clock and Tundra's shallow breathing. I pushed myself up on my arms. My back protested the night spent on the floor. 4 puppies were curled up in a warm little mass against her chest. The 5th one lay slightly apart. As if someone had put it down and forgotten to finish the job. It wasn't crying. It wasn't doing much of anything. Tundra whined softly and nudged it with her nose. Once. Twice. Her eyes met my shoulder, asking a question I'd heard before in hospital rooms and waiting areas. I picked it up. It felt lighter than it should have. The body was limp. The head drooped in my palm. The breathing was so shallow I had to squint to see the chest move. The cold was creeping back in where the warmth should have been. For a moment, I was somewhere else. Not on my living room floor, but in a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and bad coffee, where machines beeped and doctors spoke in words they didn't want to say. I held my wife's hand, telling her I was right there, and felt it grow colder and colder. And I could do nothing. This time, I forced myself not to freeze. I tucked the puppy inside my sweater, right against my chest, skin to fur. My heart was beating so hard I hoped the little body would decide to match the rhythm. I warmed a little milk, cooled it just right, and drew it up into the smallest syringe I owned. "I'm not God," I said quietly, telling myself more than anyone. "I couldn't save your wife. But maybe I can save you." I squeezed a drop of formula onto its tongue, then another. With 2 fingers, I slowly and rhythmically rubbed the tiny chest. The same rhythm I used to draw circles on my wife's wrist when her pain got bad. "Come on, boy," I whispered. "Be stubborn. Stay here." For one long minute, nothing changed. Then the tiny mouth opened, and the smallest, angriest cry I had ever heard echoed in my kitchen. The puppies got stronger. Tundra did not. A few more days passed, and my living room floor became a clumsy stage of growth. Little legs began to find their balance. They lurched from edge to edge of the blanket, chewed the corners, and tugged at it as if trying to rearrange the whole yard. They found my shoelaces. I couldn't cross the room without one clinging to me. They gripped the frayed ends of the rug, growling as if they'd caught a wild beast. Siren still cried about everything. Tumble still managed to fall off the highest point he could find. They were chaos. A beautiful, loud, living chaos. And in the middle of it all, my old Malamute seemed to shrink. Her collar grew loose around her neck. Her hips, which used to be only stiff, now trembled when she stood. Sometimes when she tried to walk, her back legs didn't quite remember what to do and she'd have to try twice. At night, when the small pack finally settled, I would watch her. She would lie with her eyes half closed, breathing slowly. And then, as soon as a small body twitched or a small sound broke the silence, she would drag herself across the blanket. She would touch each puppy with her nose, checking them in order, as if counting. Only when the last one sighed and settled would she rest her head again. One afternoon, when I went out to put out the trash, she followed me to the back door. The snow was now hard, forming a white crust over everything. She tried to climb the 2 small steps up to the porch after me. Her feet slipped. Her back half collapsed, and she went down sideways with a small, startled sound. The puppies heard the noise and swarmed her head, whimpering and licking her face as if they could stand her up from below. I dropped the garbage bag in the snow and sat beside her on the steps. I slipped my arm under her head and lifted her onto my lap. Up close, I could see how white her muzzle had become, how tired her eyes were. "I'm scared," I told her. My voice sounded older than the man I thought I was. "Not of you. Of me. I'm scared of having to bury another thing I love." The truth lay between us and went nowhere. Watching the puppies snuggled against her, I finally understood. They weren't a burden she had left on my doorstep. They were the reason she had kept going when any rational body would have lain down in that storm and never gotten up. I scratched her behind the ears the way she liked and leaned in. "If you go," I said, "I'll carry these kids the rest of the way. I promise." Her tail gave just one faint, small thump. On the day the storm finally cleared, something broke in me too. I woke up to light. Not the flat gray we'd been living with, but real sunlight, cutting through the curtains. I opened them, and the world outside whitefish looked like glass and diamonds. Every branch was rimed with ice, and the snow was blindingly bright. On the floor, the puppies stirred, slowly climbing over one another. Tails went up, heads nodded. The small troop of trouble known as German Shepherds was waking up to a new world. Tundra stirred beside them, and for a moment, I held my breath. Then, she did something I hadn't seen her do in days. She stood up. Not quickly, but on her own 4 tired legs. She crossed the kitchen, her claws clicking on the tile, leaving faint tracks from her old feet. The 5 puppies scrambled up in a disorganized line, stumbling after her, bumping into chair legs, slipping, regaining their footing, desperate not to lose sight of their savior. I opened the back door. The cold air rushed in, fresh and sharp. She walked out onto the porch like a queen inspecting her kingdom, and the puppies spilled out behind her. She sat down slowly, her joints complaining, lifted her nose, and took a deep breath. She looked out at the mountains. The same mountains my wife used to stare at when she thought I wasn't watching. Only this time, I didn't feel like I was standing at the edge of something that had ended, but looking down the road of something that was still going. Right there, with the sunlight on her gray face and 5 small shadows at her feet, I promised myself. I wasn't going to send these puppies anywhere. No backyard, no tie-out post. If they left this house, it had to be the way my wife chose the house for Tundra. With intention. With love. Later that afternoon, I dragged an old box off a shelf in the closet. Inside were fragments of my wife's memory I hadn't touched since the funeral. A scarf that still faintly smelled of her. A small tin of buttons and ribbon she had saved for future projects that never happened. I sat on the floor with a lap full of wiggling puppies and sorted colors and textures. A band of soft green ribbon for the quiet one. A bright red scrap of cloth for the loud one. A pale blue for the fighter who refused to give up in my sweater that morning. As I tied the last ribbon, I realized the terrifying truth. I didn't want to let any of them go. I once thought my house was too small for new burdens. It was apparently just too quiet. Weeks passed, and more weeks passed. The snow melted from the fence posts. The trees around Whitefish shook off their burden. Inside the house, the German Shepherd puppies emerged from clumsy infancy, gaining long legs and big feet that didn't quite fit where they were going. They still hurtled through the room like they owned it, but now they could mostly turn a corner without crashing into the table. Mostly. I knew I couldn't keep all 5, no matter what my heart demanded. So I started with the place of least pain. The ribbon one went to my neighbor, a widow we used to help split wood every winter. She stood on her porch, clutching the small dog to her chest, saying how nice it was to hear the sound of claws on her floor again. Another went to a man in town whose grandson was terrified of anything with teeth. Last I heard, the puppy was the boy's shadow, teaching him not every sharp tooth bites. The third went to a young couple who brought warm meals to my doorstep when my wife passed. They sent pictures: puppy asleep on the couch, puppy stealing a sock, puppy sitting where the Christmas tree should be. It didn't feel like the dogs were leaving my house. It felt like my house was being replicated, piece by piece, and taken to other lives that needed it. The house wasn't empty. 2 puppies remained with us, trailing Tundra like loyal satellites. She didn't run anymore. She didn't chase them like she used to. But she would sit like an old matriarch in the center of the living room, watching her small, wild squadron circle her. Sometimes they would bounce off her flank and startle. She would twitch an ear, sigh, and then lick the top of the culprit's head as if to say, "You are mine. Be still." Most nights, I find myself in the same spot on the floor where I once spread a blanket and prepared to say goodbye. Only now, warm bodies snuggle at my feet, snoring and dreaming and shifting a corner of a hardwood floor from a place where life went out to a place where life came in. On those few nights when the house is quiet, I still talk to my wife. Lately, I think I know what she would say. This story didn't start with an act of heroism. It started with fear. Mine, and hers. I was afraid of losing the last living link to my wife. Tundra was afraid enough to walk out into a blizzard and bring home 5 lives that weren't even hers. We were both just trying not to be alone when the storm came. She didn't drag those German Shepherd puppies to my doorstep to give me a problem. She gave me a second chance. A second chance at purpose. At noise. At something that needed me to do more than just pay the heating bill. Sitting at my old kitchen table now, I can tell you this: family is not blood. Family is who you pick up out of the snow. Family is who you check on at 2 a.m. when your back hurts and your heart has been broken once, and you stay for them anyway. This journey from abandoned state to recovery for these small dogs demonstrates how vital local rescue groups are. What my old dog did in the storm, people across this country do every day, one scared, shivering dog at a time. They open their doors. They open their wallets. But most of all, they open their hearts when it would be easier to close them. Caring for rescued puppies isn't just feeding them. It's a commitment. It's vet visits. It's medicine and midnight cleanup and chewed shoes and hard choices. And somehow, at 70, it brought color back into a life I was beginning to fold up. If you read this and have an older man or woman in your life, they might be sitting in a quiet house like I was. Share this with them. Not for the numbers, or the views, but to remind them it is never too late to crack the door open just a little for one more heartbeat. And if you share it just a little wider, maybe a dog somewhere, a forgotten mother, a frightened puppy, won't disappear without a trace.